Against the backdrop of the current Iran-centered regional hostilities, reported attacks have already affected health facilities, energy infrastructure, essential services, and multiple states beyond Iran and Israel. WHO said on March 5, 2026 that it had verified attacks on health sites in Iran, while the UN Human Rights Office said that the hostilities had already damaged civilian infrastructure and disrupted essential services across the region. What top war studies scholars increasingly understand is that modern war is no longer best analyzed target by target. It must be analyzed system by system. The key shift is from the law of isolated strikes to the law of interdependent civilian survival systems like electricity, fuel, ports, communications, water treatment, desalination, hospitals, and logistics. The ICRC's work on urban warfare and reverberating effects has become central here because it shows that the humanitarian impact of attacking infrastructure lies not only in the direct blast, but in the knock-on collapse of urban services across space and time. The most rigorous proposition is this. In contemporary war, especially where AI assists targeting, the legally relevant object is not only the struck facility, but the civilian survival system of which that facility is a node. That is the heart of an infrastructure warfare and cascading civilian harm framework. It treats an attack on a power substation, gas terminal, port, desalination intake, data center, or telecom backbone not as a discrete event, but as a potential trigger for predictable downstream civilian harm. This approach is grounded in international humanitarian law, not outside it. The ICRC has expressly argued that proportionality and precautions in attack require decision makers to account for reasonably foreseeable reverberating effects. This matters in the current Iran war setting because the regional battle space is unusually infrastructure dense and interdependent. Gulf and West Asian societies that depend heavily on energy corridors, maritime choke points, imported food, electricity-dependent health systems, and in many places, desalination-dependent water supply. Recent reporting has described attacks affecting Gulf sites, oil-linked infrastructure, and broader disruption to transport and services. The legal significance is not merely strategic escalation. It is that these are precisely the kinds of systems whose failure can produce mass civilian harm, even when the immediate target is framed as military or dual use. The legal foundation is conventional and strong. Article 52 of Additional Protocol 1, it protects civilian objects and limits lawful attack to military objectives. Article 54, it prohibits attacking, destroying, removing, or rendering useless objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population. Article 56, it gives special protection to works and installations containing dangerous forces. Customary international humanitarian law, it likewise prohibits attacks on objects indispensable to civilian survival. The important scholarly move is not to invent new law, but to interpret existing law systematically. Under this reading, distinction asks not only whether the node has military use, but whether the object remains presumptively civilian within a wider essential service network. Proportionality, it must include forcible indirect harm, like disease from wastewater failure, deaths from hospital power loss, dehydration from desalination shutdown, food insecurity from port disruption and communication blackouts that impede civilian warning and rescue. Precautions in attack, they require commanders to study not only the target's military function, but the civilian dependency map around it. The more interconnected the system, the more demanding the precautionary obligation becomes. Traditional targeting law often asks whether a power plant, port, fiber node, refinery, or fuel depot, it is dual use. That is necessary, but no longer sufficient. A more advanced framework asks what civilian dependency network is attached to this object. For example, an electrical node may feed hospitals, sewage treatment, water pumping, cold chain medicine storage, and desalination. A maritime choke point, it may affect food imports, fuel deliveries, humanitarian access, and accessible routes. A telecom outage that may impair civilian warning, family tracing, emergency coordination, and access to life-saving information. That broader network is what gives infrastructure warfare its humanitarian gravity. The ICRC and UN practice on reverberating effects strongly supports this way of thinking. AI does not create the law, but it changes the epistemic conditions under which the law is applied. The best scholarly point here is AI expands both capability and responsibility. AI and machine learning systems can be used in armed conflict for surveillance, navigation, target recognition, decision support, targeting functions. The ICRC has warned that these technologies raise specific humanitarian, legal, and ethical concerns, especially where human control becomes diluted or where system outputs are difficult to predict, audit, or even contest. That leads to three rigorous propositions. First, AI can improve forceability. If a military can model infrastructure dependencies, predict outages, and simulate cascading failures, then certain indirect harms become more forcible, not less. Legally, that can tighten proportionality and precaution obligations because what is reasonably forcible is partly shaped by available analytic capacity. The ICRC reverberating effects work already turns on reasonable forcibility. Second, AI can create opacity and false confidence. Article 36 Weapons and Methods Reviews become especially important where algorithmic systems they shape targeting recommendations. Scholars and the ICRC they have argued that legal reviews of AI systems must address bias, false assessments, uncertainty, human-machine interface problems, and whether operators can exercise judgment consistent with distinction and proportionality. Third, AI can compress decision time. In a high-tempo regional conflict, decision support systems may push commanders toward node disruption because it appears efficient. But legal efficiency is not humanitarian legality. A sophisticated framework should define cascading civilian harm carefully. Cascading civilian harm is the chain of reasonably forcible civilian injury, death, disease, displacement, and deprivation produced when an attack degrades an interconnected essential service system rather than merely damaging an isolated object. This is not rhetorical. It can be broken into analytically precise layers. First order effects, immediate blast, fire, physical destruction, direct casualties. Second order effects, service interruption, water loss, hospital dysfunction, sewage failure, fuel shortages. Third order effects, infectious disease, mass displacement, malnutrition, economic collapse, humanitarian access failure. Fourth order effects, prolonged rights deprivation, durable urban uninhabitability, intergenerational health harm. The ICRC's research on urban services and wastewater systems is particularly important because it shows that damage to water and wastewater infrastructure can reverberate into infectious disease risk and broader public health emergencies. Even in armed conflict, human rights law continues to matter, though its application is shaped by lex specialis and context. The right to life remains central, and attacks that forcibly collapse survival systems engage not only IHL rules, the international humanitarian rules on attack, but human rights concerns around life, health, water, dignity, information access, and effective remedy. The OHCHR has already highlighted civilian casualties, infrastructure damage, and essential service disruption in the current regional crisis in the Gulf. The deeper point is this: infrastructure warfare does not merely risk unlawful collateral damage, it risks rights deprivation by design. That is especially true where the targeted object is legally framed as dual use, but the practical effect is to deny a population the material conditions of survival. In West Asia, a serious systems analysis would map at least 6 civilian dependency clusters: energy-water coupling, port-food dependence, health system fragility, telecom and information integrity, urban concentration, cross-border spillover. In Gulf environments, electricity and fuel, they are tightly linked to water production, including desalination. Disruption to power, they can become disruption to drinking water. Recent reporting has specifically referenced concerns around power and desalination-linked facilities in the current conflict environment. Many states depend heavily on maritime trade for food, medicine, and fuel. Interference with ports or shipping routes can reverberate inland rapidly. Verified attacks on health-related sites, ambulance damage, and service disruption, they are not only direct violations concerns, they also amplify all other forms of civilian vulnerability. Disruptions to communications, they impede civilian warning, family contact, emergency services, and accountability. OHCHR, it has also raised concerns about internet shutdowns affecting access to crucial information during the current hostilities. The denser the city, the stronger the reverberating effect of utility failure. This is exactly why the ICRC has focused on urban warfare. The current hostilities have already affected multiple states, which means cascading harm is regional, not purely domestic. Before striking infrastructure, ask 5 questions. Is the object truly a military objective or merely a civilian object with incidental strategic value? Which civilian systems depend on this object directly or indirectly? Water, health, sanitation, food, communications, displacement management, which one? What cascading harms are reasonably foreseeable using available intelligence, engineering analysis, and AI-based modeling? Are there feasible alternatives? Timing changes, narrower meanings, warning measures, or operational constraints that reduce systemic civilian harm? Even if the target is lawful, would the total direct and reverberating civilian harm be excessive relative to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated? This test is doctrinally conservative and analytically advanced. It does not require a new treaty to be intellectually persuasive. The most globally relevant conclusion is, in the age of AI-enabled targeting, the law of armed conflict must be applied not only to objects, but to infrastructures as life-sustaining systems. That is where the Iran war backdrop becomes globally legible. The issue is not Iran alone. Any conflict involving Israel, the Gulf, Europe, Russia, China, India, Pakistan, or the United States can produce the same pattern: system-level disruption, cross-border civilian consequences, and machine-assisted targeting of essential nodes. I conclude with this one-line thesis. The decisive legal question in modern war is no longer only what was hit, but what civilian system was made to fail. Thank you.